Another hot topic this year, again, is the Droop rule. Lucas Oil has adopted it, the World of Outlaws have it, local sanctioning bodies are going to probably start falling that way. So let's talk about the Droop rule a little bit and see if we can find some creative ways around it. Let's roll the intro and we'll talk about the Droop rule. I've spent the last 30 plus years working on race cars, building race cars, and racing cars. And I'm here to help you better understand racing technology. I guess the first thing I want to talk about with the Droop rule is it's not so much the height of the rear. I actually think the height of the rear hurts you when you get so far, because look at all that weight you have back there. You got a fuel cell in the back. When that thing gets way up in the air, that's a lot of weight to be tipping around. That can throw things off. So it's not the height of the rear is the angle of the car. So you get good aerodynamic downforce. When in yaw, that thing is cutting into the wind like a wedge and providing tons of aero. So it's not the height of the rear, it's the angle of the front and the angle of the car. So I guess, what do you do? The obvious solution is get the front end lower. I don't want anybody to get me wrong here. I am very much for the Droop rule that Ray Cook brought up. I think his intentions are perfectly spot on. The cars, when they get that high, are getting tippy and out of control. Well, the reason why they're getting tippy out of control because you're jacking that fuel cell up, and all that weight, 7 pounds per gallon for, what are we running now? 29, 30 gallons, someplace through there. That's just a ton of weight way up high up there. You hit a curb, that car's going over. So I like Ray Cook's idea about the Droop rule. I think it is spot on, and I think it's a good idea. I'm just trying to figure out ways to get the angle. Maybe we could even run that Droop rule a little bit lower and make the cars even safer. That would be awesome to me. But my idea is, let us go with the Droop rule for safety, and then let us do some things in the front end so we can get that angle we want and get that aero without getting it too dangerous. We don't want that spoiler and that fuel cell way up in the air where that car is going to tip over. We just want to get fast and we want to make the cars consistent. So what can we do? We're already running pretty low in the front, and you have the rack up there as a limiting factor. So I guess the best solution on my mind, which I know will not go, and if it does go and people are starting to do it, they'll just make a rule and say you can't do it, is to run a sprint car style steering gear in the car, eliminate the rack and pinion, run a drag link across the front end or some sort of drag deal, and then run a link going towards the front and run like a sprint car steering gear. You can eliminate that whole under saddle or make it higher or whatever you need to do to support your front end. But you don't have to have that rack hanging way down there. It gets damaged. You could save a ton of money. It would be a good idea, but like I say, once somebody does it, they'll just make a law or a rule and you won't be able to do it anymore. So that would be the best solution, but I think there's other ways we can do this to get around that Droop rule and get that front end lower. Another thing we can do besides the sprint car steering gear is to run the rack even higher in the car. But running a higher rack means that you'll need to run a longer rack to still get your bump steer and everything to come out on your front end. So once you start raising the rack in the car, your arms are going to, or your steering points are going to have to be further apart to fall within that area of, I guess, good steering bump. And I'll do a diagram a little later on exactly how that all works and why you'd want to raise the rack in the car and then make it longer at the same time. But raising the rack up is another great option. I know there are people, I think Kaiser is making a radiator now which is shorter. So if you can put a 2-pass radiator in there or something that'll cool as good and yet be shorter, raise the rack up as far as you can, that would be ideal. And then you also have to think about your hood and exactly where your fan is, so as you start moving that radiator back and raising the rack plate up, you're going to have to get your fan in there. I know people want to run the big fans for good cooling, but you're going to have to actually, because you have hood aerodynamics there too. So there's a lot of factors to be had there when raising the rack up. It's not always as easy as it sounds. Now, it's not always, like I said, about the droop in the back and getting that back end up. It's about the overall height and getting that front end lower, however you can do it, is going to be the key. A lot of shock manufacturers now have been putting longer shafts into shorter bodies on the right front, so you get that extra travel you need to get that front end down as low as possible. And as you start pulling your right front up into the proper angle, remounting your body, another thing to think about here is, which I always loved, but I heard they have a rule against it now because somebody tried it and they instantly outlawed it, was to motion ratio your front shocks and put them on a pivot. Similar to a lot of other open wheel type of race cars that, like Indy cars have it, where it's a push rod from your right front lower up and there's a pivot and you mount your shock basically parallel to your frame rail up there and everything operates on a motion ratio. It makes sense to me because then if you figured it out right, you could put that shock someplace where first it's not going to get damaged because these things are expensive to fix, but then you can motion ratio and you can correct or adjust your motion ratio to run a lower front end and you can get more compression. You don't have to build the custom shocks with the long shaft, short bodies. It would solve a ton of problems, but again, rules makers want to make it more expensive and just keep everything the way it was and stop innovation. They love people spending $200 or $300 to fix a bent shock when your right front gets knocked off. They, for some reason, rules makers like that stuff. But that would be the obvious solution, is to motion ratio and put that shock someplace where it ain't going to get damaged. You can put a motion ratio thing on there and get more compression to your right front and save money, and that would be a win-win solution to getting your front end lower. But with everything I've said here, I think the only viable solution to getting the front end lower is to raise the rack in the car. That's all they're going to let us do, realistically, is try to keep getting that rack up. So let me go and I'll draw you a diagram on why when you raise the rack up, you're going to have to widen it out to get your proper bump steer. So let's head over to the drawing board and I'll do a little diagram. Okay, to have the bump steer right in your car, you need some things to jive. First, you need to have your rack center line on your upper control arm and lower control arm pivots here. If you draw a line through the pivots, your rack ends need to hook up with your tie rods on that line. So if you raise your rack, you're going to need to extend your rack center to center to get them to reline up on there. To get good bump steer also, you need to have the placement on the spindles correct. But when you start raising your rack for ground clearance, this is probably what you got to keep an eye on, or else your bump steer is not going to come out and the car's not going to be right. So whenever you raise your rack in the car, you're going to have to extend your rack pivots. Like I said, go from an 18 1/4 to an 18 3/4 to a 19, somewhere through there. So that's one thing to keep an eye on if you're raising your rack. Okay, if you like this video, subscribe to the channel down below and ring the bell for notifications. The notifications aren't anything spammy like we're going to hit you with email or nothing. It's just when you log into YouTube, it'll just say I have a new video up to check it out. So we'll see you in the next video.